And when you communicate, also understand that there's not one truth. Even in the Torah, we see that there are many truths. There's all the different mefarshim that sometimes contradict each other, but we know that they're all Torah and they're all truth. And people are the same. When we communicate with people and we speak and somebody has another opinion than us, it also can be true. My opinion can be true. Your opinion can be true. And part of maturing is accepting that fact. The ability to accept that different strokes for different folks. Everybody's wearing a different pair of glasses. They have different lenses on, the way they see the world. And when we stop thinking black and white, then we automatically are able to communicate differently.
Hey, I'm Esther, and you are listening to On Your Own, the podcast for Jewish girls living away from home. Each week, we bring you an inspiring person or message to help you confidently navigate life on your own so you can achieve real growth and independence and take ownership of this foundational stage of your life. For additional resources, tips, and to stay up to date on future episodes, sign up for the On Your Own newsletter, linked below in the description. Looking forward to spending some time with you today. And now, to this week's episode. Tell us a little bit about yourself and why you speak about communication.
Okay, so that would be my pleasure. What I do is I teach Kallah, so I'm a Kallah teacher. I also, even before I've done that, I have been mentoring. Mentoring is sort of like counseling people without that degree of a therapist, but trained in many different areas, including how to communicate, specifically in the therapeutic kind of environment. And I also do some kind of public speaking. Here and there I'm asked to speak, and that's something that I've actually studied. So with my mentoring, I've been trained. I'm actually a trained mentor, and I also train in different modalities of therapy. But all the things that I do, really, you need to be able to communicate well. When you teach, you need to be able to communicate well. When you speak, you need to be able to communicate well. And when you mentor, you also need to be able to communicate well. So by default, I've learned a lot about communication.
Very interesting. And I'm really excited to hear from you more about the communication piece specifically, although we could probably sit here all day with all the different roles that you play and go into those and the mentoring and all of that. So I wanted to start off with why. Why do you think it's important to learn how to communicate? Why do you think it's important that a young woman listen to this conversation and learn more about the art of communication?
So it's quite an interesting question. Why, right? So there's many questions that we can ask on your question, right? Why is it important? Why is it not important? My bigger question is, how can somebody survive in this world without learning how to be a good communicator? HaKadosh Baruch Hu created us as social beings. That means we're interactive people. We never do well in isolation. During COVID, people really suffered, especially the elderly, because they were isolated, because they were not able to communicate. The most difficult thing for a prisoner is being put in solitary confinement, right? Being taken away. When we communicate, and we communicate well, we actually are connecting to somebody else. We have a kesher. We don't feel like we're alone. We don't feel like nobody cares. We don't feel like nobody understands. And you have a much more happier, productive existence in this world when you learn the tools of good communication. Did I answer the question?
Yes, you did. And in doing so, I think that you kind of also helped give us a bit of a new definition, I would say, about communication, because what I heard from you was that communication is connection, like that they come together. which is very interesting. I never really thought about it that way. I've always maybe thought of it more as like this one-sided thing, maybe like the public speaking. I'm getting up and I'm communicating, right? I'm expressing myself. But you're saying, no, it's this two-way thing. It's actually that which all of our relationships are based on. That's very interesting. Are you able to elaborate maybe on like what communication is? How would you define it?
Well, communication is something, it's quite broad, obviously, but if I want to sort of like put it in a nutshell, communication is the way we express ourselves and allow others to express themselves. It's picking up the vibes of people. So we have the way that we think of communication as a one-sided thing. So you're sitting here with a mic like I see you. I don't know, the audience obviously doesn't see you, but I do see you. You're sitting here with a mic and with your headphones and you're speaking with me. However, the only way that I can really receive what you're saying, right, that I'm able to answer you is if you're being in touch with what's going on with me, right? Suppose you're talking to me and suddenly you see this facial expression like, oh, no, that's not good. I believe that you'd probably quickly change what you're saying or word yourself a little differently because suddenly you realize that it's not sitting so well with me. Okay, so communication is not just the ability to express yourself well. It's also the ability to hear the other person or be with the other person. Not always are we communicating with our words. Sometimes we're communicating without words. Sometimes when you just sit with someone, that's a way to communicate that you care. Sometimes listening is a form of communication. Like what you say matters. Being present, right? Being focused on what the person has to say or what the person is experiencing is another form of communication. And when we experience communication in all these different ways, and we try to improve ourselves in these different ways, then we become better communicators, and also we connect better with people because of that. So one thing a person needs to know is that if they don't express themselves, people don't necessarily know. One of a big misunderstanding, going into misunderstanding of communication, is that sometimes people think that other people around them should know or should pick up. This should word is a very dangerous word when it comes to communication or relationships in general. If you're not going to say, don't assume that people are going to know, right? And there's this like old-fashioned joke from like 100 years ago about this lady who comes to the therapist and she says, I want to divorce my husband. And he's like, and I don't understand why. He's telling the therapist, you know, we're married for 60 years. She says, well, I want to divorce him because he doesn't love me. And the husband, suddenly his eyes just like popped out, like in shock. What do you mean I don't love you? She says, you haven't told me you love me in 60 years. You told me when we first got married and that was it. He goes, well, if something would have changed, I would have let you know. So sometimes we don't always know it, but we're laughing at it. We're laughing at this joke. Like, so I told you, 2 years ago that every time, or even 2 weeks ago, that when you leave your pot in the sink that you didn't wash out, like it really bothers me. Like I'm very neat and I need to always wash your pot. And right. Yeah. So I told you 2 weeks ago and then you keep on leaving it. Well, suppose she forgot. Right.
Right.
So a lot of times we need to communicate verbally what we want to say. That's being there and being able to be receptive and listening and all these things and giving space and time for somebody and not interrupting. They're all very, very important. But there is a very major element of being able to articulate well and being able to express yourself well and understanding that you need to do that. And sometimes you need to do it continuously. Most of the time, you're going to need to do it continuously. Don't ever assume that just because you said it once, that's it. Mm-hmm. It's final. Like now the person knows it forever.
It's so hard because we, at the end of the day, only know our own experience. And so that which is like so obvious for us, we think that that's just like the way that everyone sees it. So, and then especially for girls going into new environments with girls who may be coming from different countries, maybe they're living with people, sharing a room with people from different cultures even, and you assume that that which is obvious for you is obvious for everybody. It's really hard to be able to kind of take that step back and realize that that's not the case, and you need to communicate in order for everyone to be on the same page. How do we know how to do that? Is that something that we're born with? Hashem teaches us, like as people, we just know? Is it something we need to learn? Like, how are we supposed to know how to get out of ourselves and recognize this need for communication and know how to do it?
So there's a short answer, and then there's the longer answer. So the short answer is a lot of times it's just trial and error.
Mm-hmm.
It's learning from our experience, and we really need to give that to ourselves. We shouldn't be hard on ourselves and be rough or judge ourselves for not getting it right away, or not getting it right all the time, or even not getting it right a lot of the time, because we're still young people, and you'll be young for many, many years, because life is constantly changing. The people we're interacting with are changing. So different people from different countries also communicate differently. For example, in one country, even the words that you use might mean something else, or the expressions that you use, or even the hand gestures. In some countries, they're considered complimentary. In another country, it could be considered the opposite. So a lot of it is just figuring things out and allowing yourself to figure it out, and not being so hard on yourself while you're trying to figure it out. However, what I have to say is that if you keep on stumbling, if it's something that's constantly happening, then that would be something to explore. That would be something to maybe speak with somebody, maybe somebody that you trust, or another person, a peer that you see seems to have gotten it right, and find out maybe they have some insight, like what's happening over here. The other thing that is important we also need to know is that when a person uses a word, and this is in my mentoring, this is something that comes up quite a bit. We think we know what the person is referring to, but it could very well mean that they mean something very, very different than what they're saying. For example, I was recently speaking with a girl, and she was telling me how she's so lonely, right? So I asked her about the loneliness. Like, give me an example of what it feels like. Or when do you experience it? When do you feel it most, right? And suddenly the loneliness wasn't really loneliness anymore. We redefined it as lowliness, right? That feeling of not feeling so good about herself. So she was thinking of, and she herself thought it was lonely, but really it was that lowly feeling. I was another time, just also not too long ago, speaking to a young lady who was in shidduchim, but she was very, every time her parents tried to mention a shidduch, she literally, like, she balked, like her stomach started turning, and she just couldn't handle it. So we worked through the issue. But one of the words that she used was I found to be a very strong word. And there was a situation, and she felt that she was betrayed. Now, betrayed is a strong word. So automatically, when somebody says she betrayed me, whoa, like, who? You take that step back, like, that's big. But then when I asked her to explain the situation of the betrayal, suddenly something a little different came out, and I was able to shed a little light, another perspective, right? So sometimes people use words, but they don't quite mean the exact word that they're saying. And sometimes it's a good idea when you communicate to ask, what do you mean by that? Right? Right? So if somebody is happy, you're probably not going to ask, what do you mean by that? Like when you say, I'm so happy about that. But more when it has to do with something, when you're communicating with something that's a little bit more uncomfortable, some kind of discomfort is happening, some kind of conflict is happening. A lot of times it's good to have the person Explain what they mean, because if you're going to feel like there's something there that's triggering you when you're communicating, try to find out what that person means and see if it's really something that's going to continue to trigger you once you get what they're really trying to say. So when you asked about the different people and the different kind of cultures and the different environments that they're in, yes, there's definitely a learning process, there's a growth process, and sometimes we learn the most about ourselves and about others through the mistakes that we make. And then through repairing those mistakes by trying to communicate a little better, by apologizing, by trying to understand the other person better. We learn a lot. Self-awareness, I believe, mostly comes from these kind of experiences.
So it's almost inevitable that we're going to make mistakes in this process because, as you said, that very often we express ourselves differently than what's really going on for us, and other people are doing the same thing. So they're using words that don't necessarily reflect their inner experience. And if we're doing that to each other, then inevitably we're going to have mistakes and misses. So that's interesting that you said that we need to ask, what do you mean by that? But do you have any other advice for how to navigate this? I don't know if it's called a problem, but reality that we might have a mismatch between the way we're sharing something and what's really going on for us, and that others will be having that same thing.
It's a good question. That's a very thoughtful question, actually. And what I try to help people know is that just because you said something once, it's not engraved in stone. Like when you're a student, you have one chance to say something, right? Your teacher calls on you and you answer the question. How many times after you answer the question did you feel like you could have answered it better? And then the teacher calls on someone else and she answered it better and you're thinking, oh, I could have done that. Without realizing the reason she was able to answer it better was because you already said whatever you said, and now she's just bouncing off that and adding to it and expanding on it. Or the teacher suddenly is able to expand. You're like, oh, I could have done that, right? So you have that one shot. When you take a test, so that's answering question. When you take a test, you have one shot to write that answer, right? But in real life communication, and that's not real life communication. In real life communication, when you have a dialogue, you can re-explain yourself. Or when you have a relationship with that person, you can go back to them even later on and say, I'm wondering if you understood me correctly. Like you can always continue to have that conversation. That's one of the challenges actually of text. I would say text sometimes is sort of like taking that test.
It's like final.
It's on right. And not only that, but with the teacher that's reading the test that you wrote the answer, she has another pile of 20 tests that she needs to read. And she's not really focusing on your answer other than is it correct or not correct. But when you actually communicate through text and you're writing something, the person has the ability to read it and reread it, especially if it's something that triggered them. And that's why one of the things that I try to help people learn when I'm trying to help them learn better communication skills is to, number one, try as much as you can to say things in the most positive way that you can say them. And if you have to say something that's not positive to the person, don't ever put it in writing. Better to speak it than to put it in writing. Because in writing, they'll take it however they take it. They can walk around with it for the next 2 days. You don't know if they even read it sometimes and how they're taking it if they don't respond. But if you got the person right in front of you or over Zoom or even over the phone and they didn't hang up the phone on you, you have a chance for a dialogue. You have a chance for them to explain themselves, for you to explain yourself. So text is quite tricky sometimes for so many reasons. And that's one of them.
Yeah. I love what you answered. Like, I didn't expect that when I was saying, how can we go into this kind of shabubble that is communication where we don't know what we mean and others don't know. And you're saying that it's something that we can keep improving and working on and coming back to. It's not set in stone. And that's so helpful because I was thinking, so the text analogy is super helpful because I've seen that for myself so much. I started actually a new thing where if I get a text that bothers me, I delete it. It's a new thing that not delete it for, yeah, I delete it for myself. I can't see it anymore because I noticed that I would go back and back and back and build a whole story, even though it was just a passing thing that somebody wrote and it didn't even have to be so big. So that's really helpful. And then what you were saying the other way around as well, that sometimes I've said something to somebody, I'm trying to make a good impression, and then I think about it afterwards and I'm like kind of beating myself up about it. I could have said it this way and this way and expressed it this way and this way and this way and this way and this way. And then it stays in my head going over and over it. And what I'm hearing you say is that you can fix that, right? Maybe a first impression, you can never have but even a first impression, you can have a second impression that fixes the first impression. So that's definitely very helpful, especially for girls who are constantly kind of trying to show up correctly to other people all the time when they're in places like seminary or things like that. It's not like that probably also helps with things like social anxiety, although I don't know so much about that. But like, so knowing that you can try again and you can make a better impression and you can say it better next time. What other advice do you have for somebody who wants to become a good communicator? Maybe they've struggled in the past and they want to know how to properly express what's going on for them in a way that other people understand so that things don't get lost in translation, and also properly understand what other people are trying to express to them.
Wow. That's some question. So the first thing that I would try to help them learn is not to interrupt. Okay? It's probably not the answer you were thinking about, but it's a very important answer. Is to learn not to interrupt. The other thing that I would try to help them with, if I would be working with them or trying, or if they were asking me their advice, is again, I'm going to repeat myself: is don't be so hard on yourself. And besides not being so hard on yourself, is also know that people are interested in what you have to say. So it's very possible that in a crowd, you might not get your message across, you might not get yourself across, but one on one is a lot more fulfilling for many people. Not for everybody. For some people, they're very fulfilled in a crowd, but those are the people that probably don't struggle with communicating in a crowd. For the people that are struggling communicating in a crowd, understand that the one-on-one is a very beautiful experience as well. And if we stop judging ourselves and we stop thinking negative self-talk, so besides trying to be positive as much as you can when you communicate with others, the most important type of communication that a person has is the way they communicate with themselves. And that will come out when they're communicating with others. So if they have a lot of negative self-talk, that negative self-talk will eventually come out when they're communicating, either by saying negative things or either about others or about themselves or through their body language. So the more you could speak positive, the more you could give your inner self, your subconscious, a little bit of a break, cut it some slack, right? Let it just be. It's okay. Learn how to tell yourself. So you're afraid, you're in a group. It's okay to be afraid. It's okay not to say something right now. It's okay to take that time. Sort of like nurture yourself a little bit and allow yourself to just be. So you want to talk, but you're also afraid to speak up, right? And it's okay. There's two truths can happen at the same time. And when you communicate, also understand that there's not one truth. Even in the Torah, we see that there are many truths. There's all the different mefarshim that sometimes contradict each other, but we know that they're all Torah and they're all truth. And people are the same. When we communicate with people and we speak and somebody has another opinion than us, then it's also can be true. My opinion can be true. Your opinion can be true. And part of maturing is accepting that fact. The ability to accept that different strokes for different folks. Everybody's wearing a different pair of glasses. They have different lenses on, the way they see the world, based on their makeup, their emotional makeup, based on their past experiences, based on their home life, based on their culture. There's so many different things. And there's so many different truths that can be true at the same time. And when we stop thinking black and white, then we automatically are able to communicate different. So when we stop thinking black and white about ourselves, either I'm good or bad, either I'm Hasidish or not Hasidish, either I'm a good communicator or not a good communicator, right? We have to move away as we get older. We have to move away from that black and white way of thinking and start thinking more in a colorful way. And realize that it's not this or that. Like I remember years ago, my mother telling me that when she was younger, the world was very black and white. As she's getting older, everything's starting to look gray. When she told that to me, I must have been like 8 years old, and I didn't understand what in the world she was saying. I'm thinking, what a blah world she lives in. As I got older, I totally got the black and the white starts meshing with each other, and things are not so clear cut. Things are not so much in the box the way we used to think they are. And that's something that as we get older, we need to understand. Like this week, there was a group of women that asked me to come and speak with them. So I spoke about Leah, about the Parsha. It was on Shabbos, and I spoke about Leah. And the way I started it off was basically saying there's a lot of things that we learn in life about when we're younger, when we're in the classroom. And I happened to be sitting in a classroom, so it was very interesting. The shiur was in a school, and then as we get older, we have a lot of experiences with it. So we have not a fifth grade level anymore of this fact or whatever knowledge that we gained in fifth grade. Now we have a much more mature level of it. But there's certain things that we end up, if we don't experience it, or we don't allow ourselves experiences with it, and we hold back, then we're going to continue to have whatever level we stopped at. So sometimes all we know is how we knew it in fifth grade, right? You have this kid that in your class that, let's say, was mean to you in fifth grade. And now you're 30 years old and you meet her. You're suddenly going to think of her as that mean kid, right? You haven't seen her growth. You haven't seen her development. You haven't seen how she worked on her kindness and her respect for others. And you're just going to encounter her the same way when you were in fifth grade. So Leah, when I spoke about Leah, I said, we only know her, most of us only know her when we were in fifth grade. But whoever really took the time to really get to know her as an adult and what kind of tzaddikus and what kind of person she was. And that was basically what I based the shiur on. The point is that we need to develop Rachel was the pretty one, Leah was the this, right? Everything is black and white, right? Yaakov, Esav is red, so for some reason Yaakov became blue. I don't know when that happened, right? Right? So and as we get older, we start developing more of a colorful, diverse, broad, and more understanding and accepting attitude for the people around us. But that takes time, it takes maturity, and it also, I'll go back to it and say it takes trial and error on a lot of it.
This is something that just came up last night that I was teaching in a seminary, and I'm their only Hasidus class, and so they're learning all different other things. And one of the girls was like, I can't handle how like this class is contradicting this class and everything just contradicts each other. And she was getting so frustrated. And we spoke just like exactly about this, how when you have that black and white approach, you can't receive because you've shut that opinion down already before it even expressed itself, because to you it's black or white and this is the way it is. And then also probably when you see the world as black and white, the way you express yourself isn't received well by others because you're not able to incorporate other truths. It's all just one way. So I so see how that can get in the way. And that what you brought about Leia, my mom called, she always calls it the lullaby effect. That like we learn these lullabies as children, these children's stories, and then we keep that story in our head later as well. So that's so interesting to learn that things aren't black and white.
Now, I just want to comment on what you're saying is that even though your world might be black and white, if you think to yourself that I can't communicate because my thinking is too black and white, you're never going to learn. You have to allow yourself the mistakes. You have to allow yourself to be a little bit vulnerable, okay, and make those mistakes so that you can find out how black and white your world really is. Because if you never speak up, you're never going to know.
Mm.
So if it's too difficult for you to make a mistake, that's something to a little bit look into more to find out why. Maybe you need to develop a greater level of security. Sometimes it's not our fault. Most of the time, it's not our fault. Sometimes it has to do with our background, the way we're brought up, or the different environments that we found ourselves in, and the different people around us that cause that, in a sense, to happen. However, without the trial and error, you're not going to develop this the way you need to and communicate what you need to and find out what your deficiencies are. But you need to be also secure enough to be able to absorb it. So it doesn't mean you have to be super secure, but you have to be secure enough. When I say absorb it, I mean that you need to have enough of a cushion, some kind of cushion, so that even if it pushes you over, you have the ability to bounce back. And not everybody has that. So they retreat to safety by not communicating. But it usually doesn't turn out well either way.
Mm.
So sometimes a little, either to try to have somebody guide you through that, or find a safe and secure person that you feel comfortable speaking things over with, to see how you can do things differently, or at least try to communicate to people that you know are going to accept what you say, are not going to judge you. And then from that experience, you could use that as a springboard for more risky kind of, at least in, if that's what the person is experiencing, a little bit more risky, more challenging areas of communication.
What I'm hearing is that when we don't feel safe, we automatically revert to black and white thinking because that's what keeps us feeling safe, like knowing where we stand and making sense of the world, which if we think we can make sense of such a complicated world, then we have to see it in a black and white terms. But the more we can feel safe when approaching these difficult conversations or putting ourselves out there more, the more we feel safe, the more we can actually hold space for other opinions and things that are different from ourselves. Do you have any advice for any other ways we can hold space for ourselves and feel safe when going out and communicating things that are hard and opening ourselves up to different ways of thinking and different opinions?
Well, the first thing I would say is tread slowly. Don't it's not you like, don't throw yourself in cold turkey. You do need to continue to feel safe. Like, going back to this example of this girl that came to speak with me that was afraid to, to start going out, meeting, meeting for marriage. And we actually walked through that. So once I spoke to her, And she went home and she thought about it and she came up with ideas by herself. She came back and she told me the way she was like, sort of like this self-talk that she was giving herself. But then we had to tweak that a little bit because she wasn't allowing, again, holding space for yourself. She wasn't allowing for the parts of her that were still scared. She wasn't giving them a voice, put it that way. So that's why it's important to, well, going back to what I said earlier, is to allow for these, allow for these other areas of yourself, because we're not just like, we have so many diverse, sometimes conflicting opinions, thoughts, dialogue, inner dialogues. We're multifaceted people, and if we're going to shut part of us down, then we're also not doing ourselves a favor. So when you talk about hold space for yourself, I'm saying like it's okay, and understand that there's going to be times that you're not going to always feel so safe communicating, but you might have to anyway. For example, with a boss, right? Mm-hmm. This intimidating boss, and you need to tell him that you made a mistake and you need to do whatever work over, or that it's time for a raise, right? And there are times that you're not going to feel safe, and you need to allow these parts of you, if you'll excuse me, to understand in a way that it's okay. Like it's a scary thing. It's nervous. You're afraid. But this adult self of you just needs to do it, right? And some things just have to happen, because when they don't happen, then you just get yourself into, most of the time, I'm not saying all the time, most of the time you get yourself into a worse situation. Mm-hmm. And then that's harder to crawl out of, harder to overcome. It's much better to try to take care of things early on and communicate things early on, even if you don't, even if you don't feel comfortable enough, or if you want to call it safe enough, to communicate the extent of what you're thinking or feeling, but at least put out those hints. Let people start picking up about things. For example, if you're in the apartment and there's this girl that leaves her pot in the sink, and you don't feel, you might be a little intimidated by her, or you don't know if she's interested in hearing from you, or you think certain thoughts about her, whether they're true or not, that's your reality. You might want to just start hinting to her, like, that there's, like, the pot in the sink is unpleasant for you. You might find different ways, and she probably is not going to get it. She might, but she might not. Mm-hmm. But at least you're giving yourself an opening. It's not like coming out of left field. A lot of times people hold things in and hold things in and hold things in. And then suddenly out of left field, suddenly they come, and it's like they're coming with full force, because when you pull yourself back, right? And then you want to spring forward, like if you're going to play belts, right? You're going back so you could spring forward even a greater distance. Sometimes we do that. We hold back and we push back and we don't allow ourselves. But then when we come forward, we come with like a force. And it's like, oh, 1 second, what happened here? Like, I never knew this about you. Like, where are you coming from? And sometimes it causes other people to shut down, because like they think you're crazy. Like they don't know where you came from, right? Like everything was fine because you didn't say anything. And then suddenly things are not, right? And how did that happen suddenly, right? So sometimes if you can't communicate completely, at least try a little bit to communicate, so that the person will at least get some hint that maybe something is going on. Now, another very big mistake that people make when it comes to communicating, and this is something that is very important to keep in mind, because sometimes it's the cause of people holding back from communicating. And just because this happens, it's still not, in my book, good enough reason not to continue to try. And that is that when you say something, that the person will be receptive to you. So I said it, so now they must know it. Because I said it, now they'll change their mind about dot, 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 dot. And life doesn't always work like that either.
Right.
So sometimes it's very important to clarify to the other person, or the other person should clarify what they think you mean. But even if they get what you're saying, doesn't mean that they're going to accept what you're saying. And many times people pull back from communicating because they tried and the person didn't accept, they didn't respond appropriately, or they responded in a very inappropriate way. And, or even if they responded appropriately, then it didn't make a difference. Nothing changed. And having these kind of experiences over and over again can be very dampening to somebody's spirit and make them think it doesn't pay, it's not worthwhile, nothing can change anyway, right? And then they'll take this thought process or this lens that they see about communicating and trying to work things out with others, they'll take that into other relationships as well, where that truth with that particular relationship where things didn't work out so nicely may not be true in their other relationships that they have with people, or other it doesn't have to be deep relationships, but anybody that we communicate with, we're having some level of relationship with.
Yeah, I've identified with that so much that I shut down if I think that I put it out there and it wasn't received. I'm like, okay, done. How can we know whether we haven't communicated well enough and we need to try again, or whether the other person is just not open to receiving it? Like, how can we know where the problem lies, so we can know if we should keep pushing and trying, or whether this just isn't the right fit? And I'll just to broaden the question, I'd say somebody has a roommate and they're trying, the person is just not getting it. Like, so at what point do you say, okay, I've done my bit, now maybe we need to switch roommates? Like, or at what point do you say, okay, no, maybe I need to try it this way or that way?
That's a very good question. And there's no one answer, because it really depends on each particular person. So here's where self-awareness comes in. So if you're going to speak to somebody and let them know the problem, and they'll just like say, oh, don't make such a big deal about it, just ignore her and that's it. And by the way, not answering your question, but sometimes the best way to communicate with certain people is by limiting your communication with them. By actively choosing to limit your communication with them, certain people. I'm not actively, or I'm not a proponent of this in general, but here and there, the best ways to communicate is with limited communication. And going back, and the reason I brought this up is because a person also needs to, or should try, there's no needs to, should try to be self-aware and know what their tolerance level is. And everybody's different. For some people, they can tolerate a lot, right? And for some people, it's just too difficult, and they might have other things going on with them at that point, or other complicated roommates, or other things that it's just, for them, it's just over the top. So you really have to be honest with yourself. And even though there can be a few truths at the same time, she's really nice and she's really sweet. And when I meet her in the street, we always have something to talk about, but I'm just finding it too difficult to actually share a room with her or share an apartment with her. Mm-hmm. That part of her, of, the living aspect, is just, I'm finding very challenging. Now, if you don't have a choice and you have nowhere else to go, then obviously you need to try to work something out. And with that, I would advise that person to speak to somebody that's older, wiser, has life experience, to help her navigate it. Not just say, oh, there's nothing to do. So another one of my beliefs over years that I developed is that the difference between success and failure many times is the ability to reach out and ask for help.
Not to try to do it all on your own.
Exactly.
And that takes us back to that. There's so many different ways of seeing the same thing, and not to see it all black and white. You need to sometimes get another perspective, get out of your head to figure out what's really going on and what can you do about it, and open up your options.
Right.
I wish I'd known this when I was in seminary. I'm just thinking back now to, I was the kind of person who was very assertive. I guess I'd had to learn that because I left home at a young age, so I always had to kind of stand up for myself by the time I was in sem. I knew how to say what I wanted, but it wasn't always, looking back now, and people weren't listening. So I really, really struggled to fall asleep at night, and I wanted it to be super quiet, but it was seminary. Like, what do you want from people? And so I thought everyone was just like out to get me and like so selfish. But now looking back, and I let them know that I thought that in different ways. Looking back, my request wasn't actually a fair one. And so sometimes it's possible that, yeah, you're saying to the other person what you expect, but maybe your expectations aren't fair in that context. And then also being able to speak to somebody else and get that perspective. I didn't have that. I was all just in my own head, based on my own reality, my own fears. So that could be huge, to be able to just get guidance from someone who's a little bit outside of that situation.
So a really good communicator, if you want to say what a good communicator, the attribute, let's say, that a good communicator would have, would be being self-aware. Like you were self-aware, you knew what your needs were, but at the same time not being self-absorbed.
Oh, wow.
And that would be like I would say, a good balance of being able to be communicative in a very healthy way.
Wow, that's so helpful. And I was definitely self-absorbed. And most of us are when we leave home, because we're just trying to take care of ourselves in this scary new environment. But
You're trying to survive. Anybody in
yeah,
survival mode is going to be very focused on themselves.
yeah, yeah. But if you want that to work out in your relationships, then to know how to take that step back. Okay, I could talk for like hours about this. This is so interesting. But I end off with a question with all of my guests, which is that if you could go back to the first year that you left home for the first time, and with all of the wisdom and knowledge that you now have, can share just one thing, one piece of advice with that past version of yourself, what's the one thing that you would share?
So I'll just qualify your question, how it relates to me, because the first time I left home for an extended period of time was when I got married.
Oh, wow.
So I went away to camp but then again, the first time I left home when I went to camp was 6 years old. And we're not going to talk about that because that was very young.
Yeah.
So I don't know how well that question really applies to me.
It still applies. With now that we have that context that you were married, that you'd left your home, but now you were in your own home, what would you share with yourself if you could share one thing based on what you were going through then?
That's a very good question. And I need a moment to think.
That's okay.
That sometimes, in order to communicate it effectively, and it depends who you need to communicate with, right? So sometimes it's that give and take that you constantly have, right? And sometimes you need to be quiet, right? We spoke about that. But there are times when you get married that when you communicate, you need to communicate it in a assertive way to be able to benefit the two of you. So it's very nice to have a dialogue, right? And that's something that I took me some time to learn, right? Especially if you're going to be the Akaris Habayis. So you think, okay, me and my husband will have a conversation about it, and then we'll come to a whatever, right? But sometimes you don't have time don't have time for that conversation, or sometimes the conversation doesn't go the way you want it to, or sometimes you don't always win them over. And sometimes to communicate effectively, sometimes you also need to take a stand. And you need to say, I know that this is for both of our benefit, or I know this is for the benefit of the family. And you need to take that stand. And if you're out by yourself or you're out with friends, not always is communication. So everything we said is true. But sometimes you need to just go with it. You need to just say, this is the way things are, and just go with it. Even if it's uncomfortable, and even if it's sometimes challenging, and even if you're being questioned, sometimes if you truly know it's right, and you have a mashpia and you spoke it over, let's say with the mashpia, and you know it's the right thing, sometimes you just need to go with it. So sometimes what you need to do is communicate that you're really serious about something, or something is really meaningful for you. And sometimes you're going to get wonderful, wonderful feedback or wonderful responses, and sometimes not. But at the same time, it's important that you're able to communicate it. Because if you don't, then you've just limited yourself, and you're creating greater challenges again.
Wow.
And sometimes you need to know when not to communicate something also, when it's not the right time, right? So my younger self would have wished to know these things. I'm not saying I never did it, either one, but I think the idea wasn't so crystallized and so clear to me. Even while I was doing it, I might have questioned myself, am I doing the right thing? Which is very normal for young people because we're not used to that. And that's my own personal experience. And sometimes you'll ask someone else and they'll give you something else completely. So everybody has their own story. And based on their story, they're going to share something else.
For sure. But that's so incredibly relevant and helpful for girls who need to know that they have that strength within them, if necessary, to stand by their values, their beliefs in times where it seems hard, that it's possible, and sometimes it's vital to be able to actually show up as yourself. So that's incredibly helpful. This has been an incredible interview. Thank you so much. I didn't expect any of the answers you gave, so that's always fun. Learned a lot of new things. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of On Your Own. If you like this episode or think it will be useful to someone else, please leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. I would love to connect with you. If you've got any questions, feedback, or ideas for future episodes, you can email me at onyourownpodcast@gmail.com. See you next week, and in the meantime, happy adulting.